Aquinas has a number of writings on the rational demonstration of the existence of God, and he wants to avoid two extremes. One extreme is what he would consider a certain kind of Christian triumphalism or over-optimism, which would say that God's existence is self-evident to the human mind, rationally self-evident, not by faith, but by reason. Another extreme is the extreme which he would term a kind of fideism, which would say we simply have to believe that God exists and there's no rational demonstration philosophically or lack of demonstration. It's simply a question the human mind cannot cope with by its own natural lights. He offers maybe in his whole corpus as many as 20 or 25 different kinds of arguments for the existence of God, but famously he has a centerpiece, a synthesis of this, briefly at the beginning of the Summa Theologiae, where he offers 5 ways for the existence of God. And those are based on, they're not arguments from cosmology of his age or strictly speaking, not from the scriptures or the Bible. They're arguments based on what we might call the metaphysical structures of reality. So he looks at contingency, change and movement in things, examined philosophically. He looks at efficient causality, that things are both causes of other things and themselves caused and dependent. He looks at radical contingency, the capacity of a thing to be or not to be, which of course characterizes everything around us, including ourselves. Grades of perfection in things, degrees of beauty and truth and goodness in persons and in reality. And then he looks lastly at purpose or ordered teleology in realities that tend towards final ends. And what he's trying to do is highlight in each of these 5 ways how there's a certain kind of interdependency in the realities we experience, including in ourselves, that shines forth, that pushes you to ask the question of what exists or perdures over the horizon of contingency and interdependency. And he's showing that there's what he calls an a posteriori demonstration from effects to causes, that there must exist some transcendent cause of this web of interdependent realities of which we are a part, and which is the fabric of the existence around us. So he thinks there are indirect demonstrations of the existence of God, not immediate intuition, not a mere question of faith, but a kind of fragile but real reasoning towards God as a term of human thought. Well, there's always been in the Christian tradition, a certain more marginal strand of thought that is a radicalization of Augustine's thought. Augustine himself held that there are arguments for the existence of God by reason alone. But this strand of thought would argue that, in fact, human reason is so frail, so diminished by compromises, the complicities of the human will have so diminished reason's capacity to vibrantly reason lucidly for itself, that really trying to reason about God or argue philosophically for the demonstration of the existence of God is a waste of time and, in fact, probably a pretension. And this is actually, I think, rather forcefully argued in Luther's thought, and it has become a commonplace theme in some Protestant thinkers, like Karl Barth. Aquinas has the famous dictum, grace does not destroy nature, but heals it and perfects it. Yes, human nature is frail, and human reason is sometimes very weak and fallible, but it's also very noble and very dignified. And if you, in the name of grace and the exaltation of the divine revelation of God, diminish human reason, not only do you diminish God's creation thereby and dishonor God the Creator, but you also will end up repressing one of the deepest, most noble dimensions of the human person, which will have its revenge on you. And your human nature will seek eventually to reassert itself and establish its own rational autonomy. And so you can get a dialectic that exists between a position of faith alone versus rational autonomy, which is one of the oppositions that Aquinas is careful to avoid, and which is a very false opposition. Not necessarily, but you're going to be an incomplete person. If you rely on faith alone, without the cooperation of your natural reason, that could be by humility, because there are people who are simpler. They're not going to be able to solve all the great problems of the world, and faith is a grace, a supernatural grace. I'm talking about divine faith, not simply human trust in other people, which is not always a bad thing. But divine faith, the trust in God that comes from the grace of faith, enlightening the heart and mind, allows people, even simple people, to have great intimacy with God on a very sophisticated level. That's one of the amazing things about faith. But it shouldn't be used as a pretext to diminish or suppress what in us is deeply good and natural. And, well, a danger is that you're going to end up harming the human person and, in fact, compromising the rational intelligibility of faith itself. Well, since the Enlightenment, you've had a number of extremely influential thinkers reassert the autonomy of reason, and to say that the autonomy of reason really to be itself fully has to eschew the good of faith, or that reason can demonstrate the illogical or unhelpful character of faith. The First Vatican Council of the Catholic Church in the 19th century took a contrary view by arguing that the dignity of reason is such that it can ascend towards the question of God, and the question of God should not be neutralized because that actually diminishes the nobility of man. So allowing the question of God or the question of soul, the question of the religious and metaphysical meaning of human existence to emerge is a sign of the liberation of human reason. And human reason can also come to reflect on its own limitations, not by a kind of artificial frustration of itself by something outside of itself, but by being aware that by going to the term of its own reflections, it's nevertheless seeing that there are certain fundamental questions it can't fully resolve for itself. I mean, when you hit up against questions like the meaning of evil, or the meaning of human death, or the question of God, the moral dimensions, the moral drama of the human condition, there's a certain amount of intelligibility natural reason can shed on those subjects, but there's also going to be frontiers where the mind is left looking off into a horizon and it has questions that remain unanswered, natural questions. And that's a natural openness towards the idea or the question of divine revelation. Why could God not reveal something which addressed the deepest aspirations of my human reason, while in fact doing so in such a way as to liberate me to seek the truth more deeply? Well, St. Thomas says that the strongest argument against the existence of God is the existence of evil in the world, which is the argument also mustered by David Hume. And as I've gotten older in life, I've thought that made a lot of sense because I've experienced more, moral or physical evil in the universe. It's not convinced me, but I mean, I think that that's an interesting argument. And actually, Aquinas has a really interesting argument that positing the ontological reality of evil, the privation of good and things, is itself ultimately a rational grounds for arguing that God does exist, because there is a supreme good that's the measure of all the inferior goods that get eroded by evil. However, my own education was more in the postmodern guild, and I was experiencing, 18, 19, 20 years old, the literature of Foucault and Nietzsche and that kind of crowd. So for me, the real problem wasn't arguments for or against the existence of God. It was the question of finding any kind of stable orientation or foundation upon which you would build any kind of rational or logical structure by which to understand reality. And I was very skeptical about that. And I still think that, although I don't agree with that position anymore, I still think that Nietzsche and Foucault, particularly Nietzsche, diagnose a lot of the syndrome of the relativism of modern human discourse and reason. And they put their finger on the crisis, I think, rather profoundly. So I think Nietzsche is a really important figure for helping us to understand where we are as a culture today.